As the sun dipped behind the ochre rooftops of Ouagadougou, the plaza known as Revolution Square was bathed in a golden, trembling light. The crowd, vast and volatile, murmured like a tide. Some came for hope. Others came for answers. But all eyes were fixed on the figure in military fatigues standing upright on the podium. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who had seized power not with promises but with action. He spoke with clarity, his voice cutting through the humid dusk. Yet just behind him, shrouded in silence, were three men. Not politicians, not advisors, just shadows in human form. They never stepped into the spotlight. They never reached for the microphone. And yet without them, Captain Traoré would never have stood there. Burkina Faso, a country that had long danced with betrayal, was no place for naivete. Since 2015, when the elite guard of former President Blaise Compaoré was dismantled after a failed coup, the people had grown wary of men with guns and quiet power. Those who were once trusted had turned traitor. Those who wore medals had too often carried knives beneath them. Traoré had studied that history. When he rose through the ranks and took control in 2022, he made a vow not to repeat the mistakes of the past. His bodyguards would not be symbols of arrogance, but guardians of purpose. He handpicked them not from political ties, not from power-hungry battalions, but from those he had fought beside, bled beside. And so they came, the silent sentinel with a covered face known only as the masked man, the thunderous fighter from the north whom the world called Gaddafi, and the quiet strategist, the mind behind the operation known simply as Number 3. That evening, under the rustling flags and the chants of a hopeful crowd, they were stationed with invisible precision. One scanned the rooftops, one moved among civilians in plain clothes, one far off in a control room watched through a blinking wall of monitors. To the public, Traoré stood alone. But to those who understood how fragile power truly was, he stood surrounded by loyalty forged in fire. Then came the crack of gunfire. It was faint, distant, perhaps a mile away, but to men trained in vigilance, it might as well have been next door. The masked man positioned behind a column vanished into the crowd like smoke. His hand brushed the holster at his hip. At the same moment, in a building across town, Number 3 rose from his chair and gave a single nod. Orders were already being executed. Gaddafi, still among the crowd, slowly placed his drink on the ground and moved toward the edge of the square. The plaza, meanwhile, continued as if nothing had happened. The people did not hear the signal. They did not see the change in formation. That was the point. Traoré kept speaking. His voice never broke his breath, never caught. But he knew. He knew that power in Burkina Faso had always changed at gunpoint, that revolutions were not sustained by speeches alone. They were held together by vigilance, by sacrifice, and by the silent men who stood just beyond the light. Later, long after the event, after the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, the three protectors met in a quiet hallway of the presidential compound. No words were spoken. A single nod passed between them. Another day survived. Another threat, maybe real, maybe not, but answered all the same. From the outside, no one would ever know. To the nation, Traoré stood tall, alone. But behind him, always, were the shadows. And somewhere in those shadows, a promise still echoed: we will not let what happened to Sankara happen again. No one knew his name. No medals, no television interviews, no stories in the newspaper. And yet everyone in the presidential compound knew this much: he was always there. At the corner of every hallway, behind every crowd, in the reflection of every window, like a shadow with breath. The soldiers called him the masked man. Even in the harsh heat of Ouagadougou, he never removed the black cloth that hid his face. Just his eyes, sharp, still always moving, gave away that there was a man beneath the mask. But who he truly was and what he carried inside remained sealed behind silence. That night, the compound was quiet. The city outside stirred with murmurs of unrest. Gunfire had echoed again near an army post. Maybe just a warning. Maybe more. Inside, the masked man stood at the door of Captain Traoré's private quarters. His body was still a living statue in black. His ears heard everything. Footsteps, flickering lights, the far-off scratch of gravel under a vehicle. He touched his earpiece lightly. North perimeter. Unconfirmed movement. Stay alert. The corridor dimmed suddenly. Not by accident. A signal. His fingers closed around the grip of his weapon, calm and smooth. No panic. Just readiness. He adjusted position slightly, one pace to the left, a better angle, tighter shadow. It might be nothing. But if it was something, he would be the first and the last line of defense. They said he used to be special forces, a ghost among militants in the Sahel. They said he crawled into enemy camps at night, stole maps from under pillows, and vanished before the dogs barked. Some said his face was covered because jihadists had placed a price on his head. But that was all just talk. The truth was simpler. When Traoré seized power in 2022, he knew trust couldn't be delegated. Loyalty wasn't assigned, it had to be proven. So he called on men he knew. Not in meetings, not on paper, but in the grit of war. The masked man was one of them. They had fought side by side under the burning sun, where maps turned to ash and radios failed. Once during a clash in a dusty village surrounded by screaming militants, Traoré's unit ran out of ammunition. Chaos broke loose. One soldier lay bleeding, unable to move. Without a word, the masked man had dropped to the ground, crawled under gunfire, and dragged the man to safety. He did not wait for orders. He did not hesitate. That night changed everything. Now, years later, Traoré trusted him with his own life. In public, the masked man was barely noticed. A cap pulled low, a hand resting near his hip. But every time the captain bent to greet a child, shook a hand, leaned to speak, he moved. Just a few inches, enough to cover an angle, to scan a pocket, to feel the pulse of a room. His job was not to be seen. His job was to make sure danger never reached the man he called brother. Then came the message. It arrived one night just after midnight. A simple encrypted note on a secure line he rarely used. A stranger's voice, flat and professional. $5 million. One clean strike. During prayer when he kneels. No witnesses. He stared at the screen for a long time. Not because he was tempted. No. That thought never existed in his mind. He was furious. He paced for hours, fists clenched. Not because his pride was wounded, but because someone had dared to think he was capable of such betrayal. Because someone somewhere believed that money could buy the bond he shared with Traoré. By dawn, he had a plan. He passed the message quietly to Commander Cabri. No names were shared, no papers signed, just eyes meeting across a room, understanding exchanged without a word. A trap was set. 2 nights later, in a warehouse at the edge of Ouagadougou, the masked man stood alone under a flickering bulb. The suitcase arrived first, black leather, unmarked. Then came 2 men, foreign accents, greedy eyes. He said nothing, just stood there, hand resting on the weapon he had no intention of using. Before a deal could be made, Cabri's men emerged from the shadows. Calm, surgical, not a single shot fired. The men were arrested. But the masked man made only one request. Don't announce it. Let me stay where I belong in the dark. Word still got out. In the cafes and the alleys, people whispered of the man who turned down millions. Some said he had killed the traitors with his bare hands. Some said he vanished afterward into the hills. But the truth, as always, was quieter. He had simply said no. When Traoré heard the full story, he didn't call a press conference. He didn't summon generals. He called the masked man into his office, just the 2 of them, the president in uniform, the guardian in black. He looked him in the eyes, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," he said. The masked man didn't answer. He only nodded once and returned to his post. For him, it was not a job. It was a mission. He believed in something greater than safety. He had seen Traoré at the front lines refusing to flee. He had watched the captain stand firm under threats from foreign powers. He believed in this fragile, burning dream, a free and fearless Burkina Faso. Every morning, after long nights with no rest, he removed his mask only once to wash his face and whisper a prayer. "Thank you, God, one more day with my president alive." Then he put the mask back on and stepped into the shadows, because the nation must never see him coming, but he will always be there, waiting. They called him mad, a warrior touched by spirits, a man who charged into battle when others ran, but those who truly knew him used a different word: devoted. Gaddafi's real name was spoken only in small circles, whispered in old villages where the sun scorched the soil and cattle roamed like shadows. To the rest of the country, he was just Gaddafi. The name stuck like dry earth on boots. Some said he got it from the way he fought fearless and unchained like the legendary bodyguards of Muammar Gaddafi. Others thought it was because of his bold tongue and booming laugh. But in truth, the name was born on a day when he stood alone between his family's cattle and a group of armed bandits. He was just a boy then. He carried nothing but a stick and the memory of his father's last lesson. You don't run from what feeds your people. When the shots rang out and the dust thickened with panic, he planted his feet in the earth and refused to move. The bandits turned back. The village never forgot. Years later, when jihadist violence began to spread across Burkina Faso like wildfire, he joined the army not to become a soldier, but to become a shield. He fought in the deep forests of Otapuanu. He bled in the dry plains near Djibo. He buried brothers under trees and prayed beside smoldering tires. That was where he met Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Their first meeting was forged in chaos. Gaddafi's unit had been surrounded low on ammunition, high on despair. The enemy circled like wolves. Then came the sound of trucks, not fleeing but charging. Traoré's unit had arrived young and hungry, and Traoré himself didn't hide in a vehicle. He walked ahead of the front line, gave orders, calmly fired his own weapon with precision. Gaddafi saw it. He saw something in that young man that made his chest tighten, not fear, but hope. When his bullets ran dry, he picked up an old machete from a fallen comrade. And then he ran straight into the enemy lines, screaming like thunder. His charge shattered the moment, scattered the enemy, and gave Traoré's unit the seconds they needed to strike back. After the smoke cleared, Traoré found him under a baobab tree, pressing a rag to a gash in his arm. He was smiling. When asked why he had done it, he simply said, "I only did my duty." That was the day Traoré said, "I want him near me always." Since then, Gaddafi had become a myth. Children told stories that no bullet could pierce him. He wore small leather amulets, gris-gris around his neck and wrists, given by his mother. Whether it was luck, faith, or something else, he always walked away from fire. Once, during an ambush on a convoy, a bullet grazed his cheek. Blood ran, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he jumped out of the truck, vanished into the bush, and minutes later, the gunfire stopped. When the team found him, he was standing over the unconscious attacker. His fists bruised his chest, rising steady. "He's lucky I didn't bring the machete," he said, wiping his face with his sleeve. But Gaddafi was not just a fighter. Off duty, he was the glue that held the team together. He told terrible jokes, exaggerated war stories, even managed to get a chuckle from the stone-faced masked man. In their small circle, he was the fire, the warmth in the cold, the laughter in the tension. But when it came to the captain's safety, his joy disappeared. He became steel. He had his own methods. Sometimes he blended into the crowd, wearing simple clothes. Once in Bobo Dioulasso, when Traoré was giving a speech to young farmers, Gaddafi stood in a faded shirt among the onlookers. His hand rested near a hidden firearm, his eyes scanning every rooftop, every parked car, every shifting silhouette. He did not blink. And then came the test. Late in 2023, he was invited for porridge by a man from his home village. A man who used to borrow tools from his father. They spoke of childhood, of mothers, of goats and harvests. Then the tone shifted. "Is Traoré really worth dying for?" the man asked quietly. There is another way. A better life. Help us. Remove him. Gaddafi froze. The spoon in his hand hovered mid-air. Then slowly he placed it down. His eyes turned to steel. He leaned across the wooden table. "Speak of betrayal again," he said, "and we are finished." He stood. He walked away. And the next morning he filed a full report with Kabri. For Gaddafi, there were no gray lines. There was loyalty, and there was treason. That night he sat by a small fire, turning a worn photograph in his hand. It was Umar, his best friend, lost to an IED years ago. They used to share dried mango under the stars. Umar had dreamed of opening a school. He never got the chance. Gaddafi stared at the fire and whispered, "Never again." He thought of Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary martyr, betrayed by those closest, shot not by strangers but by former brothers in arms. That memory burned inside him like dry coal. He once told the masked man in a rare moment of silence, Traoré must not end like Sankara. One morning during Eid prayers, Captain Traoré knelt on a simple mat beside his soldiers. No medals, no uniform. Just a man bowing before God. Gaddafi stood nearby, not praying, but watching. Always watching. He looked at the young president, his forehead on the ground, and he felt something stir. He remembered his mother's cracked hands, his father's broken sandals, the smell of firewood. And in that moment he made a promise, silent but eternal. God protect him, and I will protect him. He touched the gris-gris on his wrist, scanned the horizon once more, and stood tall. The sun rose over the base. Peace held for now. And Gaddafi, warrior of the north, bearer of memory, guardian of the revolution, was ready for whatever would come next. At a certain hour in the presidential compound, just before the sky shifts from ink to ash, a lamp is lit in the smallest office at the end of the west wing. No guards stand outside. No noise comes from within. And yet decisions made in that quiet room ripple across an entire nation. Lieutenant Commander Kabri sat still, a cup of unsweetened tea cooling by his hand. Papers were arranged like puzzle pieces on the table. Some bore scribbles, some were blank, but in his mind they connected. He was the third man in Traoré's bodyguard unit, but not by rank. He was third because that was his role, the one who never stood in front, never stood beside, but always stood just behind, seeing what others missed. People called him Number 3, not out of disrespect, but because even in a world of shadows, he was the deepest shadow of all. He didn't come from rebellion. He didn't earn his place with fists or bullets. His power was his mind, and the silence he carried like armor. Back in the late 1990s, Kabri had joined the military under President Compaoré. It was a time of whisper and fear. One wrong word could undo a career. So Kabri learned to listen more than he spoke, to observe more than he reacted. He rose through the ranks quietly invisible, but essential. He once served in the RSP, the feared elite guard that in 2015 turned its guns on the people. Kabri watched from within as tear gas clouded the streets and bullets tore through trust. That day marked him forever. When the RSP was dissolved, Kabri didn't protest. He understood. A bodyguard must serve the Republic, not the man who sits on the throne. That was the lesson that separated him from the rest. So when Traoré came to power in 2022, it shocked many when he called on Kabri. Not because they were friends they weren't, not because they had history they didn't, but because Traoré knew what he needed: a guardian who owed him nothing, who would not flatter, who would not bow, who would protect not just his body, but his vision. Kabri accepted under one condition: loyalty to principle, not to power. He rebuilt the presidential security unit from scratch. He trained the team to think in layers, to see beyond weapons to intentions to patterns to silence. He taught them that paranoia wasn't weakness, it was survival. And then in January 2024, paranoia saved a nation. It began with whispers, officers meeting too often in cafes, retired colonels suddenly flush with money-coded messages between stations. Kabri didn't sleep. By January 14th, the fourth coup attempt against Captain Traoré had been stopped before it began. Not with tanks, not with force, but with anticipation. The arrest of key plotters took place at dawn. Not a single shot fired. Traoré didn't ask how he did it. He simply nodded, and Cabri returned to his post. But Cabri paid a price. One of the arrested men had been a friend, a man who had stood by him at his wedding, shared rice, shared prayers. When he saw the name on the list, something inside him cracked. That night, in the privacy of his office, he poured a glass of water, set it down and whispered, "I would have trusted him with my life. Maybe I already did." Later, Traoré placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "What matters is that you stayed loyal." Cabri didn't reply. There was no reply. In April 2025, the threat returned, this time louder. Wire transfers from Côte d'Ivoire, meetings in civilian clothes, satellite images of new faces outside army posts. It was foreign money, a foreign plan, and it aimed to strike at the heart. Traoré turned to Cabri. "How do we protect ourselves from our own?" Cabri's response was bold. "If we cannot trust all of our own, we must bring in outsiders." Soon after, 200 elite soldiers from Chad arrived under deep secrecy. Their orders were clear: protect the outer ring and report only to Cabri. They were a buffer-neutral firm, unshakable. Inside, Cabri kept the Burkina Faso close, his chosen few, including the masked man and Gaddafi. But the message was clear: vigilance would no longer be divided by patriotism alone. That month, Cabri's team foiled yet another plot. Mercenaries had been tracking a decoy convoy, believing Traoré was inside. Instead, they were met by empty vehicles, sandbags, and steel. No mercy. No headlines. Every Sunday before the sun rose, Cabri still walked to the family shrine. He lit a small candle, knelt slowly, and prayed not for victory but for clarity. For the nation. For the team. For his wife and daughters, who always asked if he would return. "I will," he told them. He had to believe it. That morning, the sun spilled soft pink light through the compound. Traoré was scheduled to speak to the nation. His words would reach millions. Cabri had already walked the route twice. Every camera had been checked, every window noted. The masked man was already stationed in the upper gallery. Gaddafi stood among the musicians with a tambourine and a hidden blade. And Cabri, he sipped his tea, watching the light shift on the floor. He thought of the young captain who refused to bow. He thought of the wild fighter who feared nothing. He thought of the silent guardian who said no to money, no to betrayal. And then he thought of himself, the man who kept the roof from falling in. He closed his eyes for a moment, then, like always, he went back to work. Because failure is not an option. Not on his watch. The sun rose slowly over Kaya, casting golden light across the open military base. It was Eid morning, a sacred day of prayer, rest, and remembrance. Soldiers in pressed uniforms moved quietly, voices, hushed hearts softened. Even the air felt different, as if the war had paused for just a moment to let men breathe. Captain Ibrahim Traoré knelt among his soldiers, dressed in a simple white robe. No medals, no rank. Just another man bowing to God. His forehead touched the earth, and for a moment, all noise disappeared. But not for the three shadows watching. The masked man stood on a nearby rooftop, crouched behind a broken satellite dish. From that high perch, he scanned the crowd through his scope, his eyes locked on every movement. Gaddafi was among the worshippers, wearing a gray boubou, a soft prayer cap, and no weapons visible, at least none the crowd could see. Cabri sat in a temporary control room inside the base, eyes on 5 monitors, ears on every channel of radio traffic. The threat had come 2 days before. A foreign contact intercepted a coded message: strike at prayer. When he kneels, no backup, no armor. 1 shot. Cabri had read it twice. Then again. He circled the words with his pen, folded the paper, and burned it. The team moved within the hour. They didn't cancel the event. That would have been weakness. It would have sent the wrong signal, not to the enemy, but to the people. On Eid, the leader had to be among his soldiers. That was the promise. So they built a plan around faith. The masked man arrived before dawn, climbing the building quietly. He placed water bottles along the edge of the roof, not for thirst, but to mark wind direction. His weapon was disassembled and reassembled twice. He whispered a short prayer before loading the final round. Gaddafi arrived dressed as a regular man. He walked with the crowd, laughed softly, shared dates from a paper napkin. But his eyes never relaxed. He touched the gris-gris around his wrist before every scan. The dagger beneath his robe was curved and silent. Cabri coordinated every layer. Plainclothes agents in the parking lot. Mobile jammers set to block remote signals. 3 possible exit routes prepared. Medical teams on standby but out of sight. Nothing left to chance. Except the human heart. Because even with all their planning, the moment would still come when Traoré bowed, and everything would rest on the faith that no one in that sea of men had come to kill. And then the call to prayer began. The crowd aligned their mats in rows. The imam stepped forward. The base grew quiet. Hundreds of men bowed together as if carried by one invisible tide. And Traoré, young, bold, beloved, bent his body in surrender. His hands rested on his knees, then his forehead dropped to the prayer rug. Sujud, the moment of deepest vulnerability. His back exposed, his eyes closed, his breath slowed, and somewhere beyond the walls, a rifle clicked into place. The masked man whispered, "There." Movement, slight, a flicker on the far edge. A man adjusting his stance not quite with the rhythm of prayer. Hands moving the wrong way. A shadow shifting in a vehicle that should be empty. Cabri caught the signal. His hand hovered over the comms button. He had trained for this. Prepared. But now, as he watched the crosshairs align on a man already bowed in prayer, he felt time stretch. Do we strike in sacred time? Do we risk chaos? Then came the voice in his earpiece. Gaddafi. 3 words. Permission to engage. Cabri's jaw tensed. His finger pressed down. Take him. The next second passed in silence. Not a shot fired. Not a scream. Just a blur of motion. Gaddafi had moved. He crossed the prayer field in seconds, hands low breath, steady. He reached the target just as the man began to raise the weapon. Gaddafi did not shout. He did not warn. He struck low, fast, firm. The weapon dropped. The man groaned, twisted, then collapsed. The blade had cut nothing vital but enough to end the mission. A second agent moved to react, but the masked man's voice barked through the comms. Don't! The would-be second attacker froze. He felt something, perhaps instinct, perhaps fear. Then he saw the barrel aimed at his chest, steady as a mountain. The shot never came. He dropped his weapon. In the crowd, no one noticed. The prayer ended. People embraced, wished one another peace. Traoré stood, smiled, shook hands. His robe was dusty at the knees, but his heart was light. He had survived again, though he did not yet know how close the knife had come. Later that afternoon, inside the compound, the 3 men met. No celebration, no applause, just silence. Gaddafi placed the curved blade on the table. The masked man sat down and removed his cap for the first time that week. Cabri looked at both of them, then at the wall. He spoke one sentence. They are testing us again. And Gaddafi, still catching his breath, replied, Let them test. We're still here. Outside, the Eid celebrations echoed into the night, and above it all, 3 guardians stood watch. Not because they had to, but because they believed. The summer heat pressed gently against the city of Ouagadougou. The sky was wide and pale, and the streets hummed with a cautious calm. It was the first day of June 2025. Inside the presidential compound, preparations were quiet. No brass bands, no fireworks, just a podium, a camera, and a speech that would soon be heard across every village, every market, every camp. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a mirror, adjusting the buttons on his uniform. The lines under his eyes had deepened. The weight on his shoulders had grown heavier, but his posture remained the same, upright, steady, unshaken. This speech was not just about policy. It was a promise. Behind the curtain, 3 men moved like shadows. The masked man checked the perimeter. His steps light, his fingers brushing hidden sensors along the window frames. He had not spoken all morning. He had not needed to. Gaddafi sat on a wooden bench near the stairs polishing a blade with a cloth from his childhood home. His wrist still bore the gris-gris now darkened with years of sweat and sun. He hummed an old tune, half lullaby, half war song. Kabri stood in a quiet room, watching a live feed of the plaza. He whispered into his mic clear on all sectors. Then he folded his hands and closed his eyes for 5 seconds. They were ready. The plaza outside filled slowly, women in headscarves, children clutching plastic flags, elders seated under tents. The air smelled of roasted peanuts and dust. It was not a festival. It was a gathering of breath, of memory, of waiting. Traoré stepped up to the microphone. The applause was brief, respectful. The silence afterward, deeper. He began softly. "My countrymen." And behind him the 3 stood like pillars. They did not blink. He spoke of justice, of land reform, of defending villages once abandoned. He named martyrs and promised their dreams would not rot in shallow graves. He did not shout. He did not boast. He said, "We no longer live in fear." At that moment, the masked man glanced to his left. A pigeon lifted from a rooftop wings, fluttering like a torn flag. He nodded once, no threat, just wind. Gaddafi shifted his weight. His left hand moved slightly toward his belt, where a short wooden baton rested. His eyes scanned faces, not for danger, but for doubt. Kabri watched a line of men in the 3rd row. One turned slightly, whispered something, nothing unusual. But Kabri noted it, logged it, and relaxed. Sometimes a whisper was just a whisper. Traoré paused, looked to the sky, then said the words that would be remembered. "We will not be governed by those who serve elsewhere. We are our own, and we rise not because we are many, but because we are enough." The crowd stirred, and then, just for a heartbeat, it felt as if time folded in. Because while the captain stood alone in the light, he did not stand alone at all. He stood inside a wall of loyalty, silent, sacred, unseen. 3 men. One carried the weight of decisions. One carried the weight of wounds. One carried the weight of vision. They did not ask to be known. They did not pose for photographs. They would never be heroes in the eyes of history books. But they were something rarer. They were the reason the story didn't end. When the speech finished, the crowd clapped slowly, then louder, like rainfall building on a metal roof. Traoré bowed slightly, then turned. The masked man stepped back into shadow. Gaddafi tapped the handle of his baton, twice a habit that meant all clear. Kabri spoke a final word into his mic. Home. Later that night, after the plaza emptied and the sun slipped behind the hills, the compound lights flickered once. A breeze passed through the corridor. The 3 men met briefly in the hallway, no words exchanged. But in that shared silence was something stronger than speech. It said, "We are still here." And as long as they were so too, was the fragile flickering flame of a nation trying to rise again. Because power alone cannot protect a dream. But sometimes 3 shadows can.